In this video, I want to discuss the Tachash skins which appear in the Torah. The commanded holy place of the Torah is the tent of meeting, and the tent of meeting itself has a covering which is made of this material. There are covers for the articles of the tent of meeting, such as the ark, which are also made of this. Since the tent of meeting is not currently active, this is more of an academic question rather than a practical one, but I believe in the future that people will return to the Torah, and a significant part of the Torah is the commanded holy structure and the commands associated with it. So I believe that it will either be fully rebuilt at some point or it will be recovered and repaired. With that in mind, research and study of these commands does bear relevance to that future time. To start off with, I want to clarify that I don't have an overly strong opinion on this subject at this time. There are a number of views on the subject which I'm going to refer to in this video, and while I do see some of these as certainly more compelling than others, I have not decided on one particular view with 100% certainty. As far as the text is concerned regarding this word, it is almost exclusively used in the Torah. And in that it appears in the context of the tent of meeting and the tabernacle, and it is usually accompanied by the word for skin or leather. The only other clear reference in the Hebrew Bible is one reference in the latter part of the Tanakh in Ezekiel 16:10. There's a reference to sandals being made with this material, and in the context it seems to imply that it is a luxury item. Another thing to note is that it is spelled differently in some of these Samaritan manuscripts, so that may be relevant if we compare it to words of other languages. Other than that, we don't have a lot of information from the text to help us with this word. As a result, there's somewhat of a broad range of different interpretations for what the word refers to. Some believe it to be a type of animal, some believe it to be a color or type of dyed leather, and some believe it to be a different type of processing which is being done to the leather. Now that we've considered what the text says, I want to get into examples of different interpretations of this word. The one that people are probably most familiar with is the translation used in the King James Version, which is badger skins. From my understanding, this has origins going back before the King James Version to Martin Luther or otherwise. The way I understood it to have been arrived at is not necessarily dissimilar to the way that many scholars look at obscure words in the text today and try to interpret them. The exception in this case was, instead of comparing Hebrew word to words from other Semitic languages or languages from that geographic area, he compared it to Germanic words, and as a result he arrived at badger for the translation, hence the badger skins. Of course, some might suggest that this is unreasonable because such an animal is unclean, so the person obtaining the skin may be violating a command by touching the carcass of the badger. Also, some might question whether an unclean animal would be involved at all with anything related to the tent of meeting. Even aside from that, there doesn't appear to be much legitimacy behind this interpretation, but it's not the only one of its kind. There's also a claim in rabbinic writings that appears to refer to a similar animal, but that does not appear to have much backing behind it either. The next claim is supported by a number of sources, which is to say that it was a blue-purple color or dye that was being applied to the skins. This is the way the Greek and Latin translations render it. With regard to those early translations, I would not give too much credence to them because there are clear examples of them mistranslating words that we know the meaning of, so the fact that they render it that way is not particularly compelling. However, there are other sources which speak similarly. Josephus, an early rabbinic opinion, apparently shared the same view, that it was a blue-purple color. So this is not just a case of the Greek translation saying something strange. There are multiple sources which claim that same thing. One counter-argument against this, which I have seen, is to say that tekeleth, which is used in Numbers 15 to reference the colored thread included in the tassels, would be the same color, and since this is a different word, it can't mean the same thing. Personally, I do not think that this is a legitimate argument, and one reason I say that is because my understanding of the word tekeleth is that it refers to a deep blue or blue-purple wool only. So it makes sense the word would be different since we're talking about skins rather than wool. So this possibility of it being a blue-purple color or dye does have some backing as far as historic understandings are concerned. The next possibility I want to go into is that maybe it is a type of fine leather or stretch leather. There's a similar word in Egyptian which refers to stretching leather, and while it's not overly common, there do appear to be examples of loan words from Egyptian into Semitic languages. The only real direct criticism that I've seen of this view is that saying that scholars shouldn't be comparing Hebrew to Egyptian as much as some have done, and that there have been mistakes made in the past because of this practice. That being said, I would not see that as any sort of decisive point against it. Stretch leather or fine leather may still be a possibility. This next assertion I came across a number of times while I was researching the unclean birds lists of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Many of the scholarly discussions of different birds which are mentioned in the Torah were often accompanied by discussions of other animals mentioned in the Torah or in the Tanakh at large. The observation that multiple people made in relation to Tachash is that a similar word appears in Arabic, which refers to the porpoise or dugong or similar aquatic mammals. Of course, this would be an unclean animal, but some might point out that the aquatic life commands in Leviticus 11 do not specify the touching of the carcass as being prohibited, and maybe the skin, once it's removed, would no longer be considered the carcass. That being considered, the similarity to the word is definitely there. It is almost identical in terms of the consonants. Also, Israel Aharoni, a zoologist that connected his research with the Hebrew Bible, made the case that some of the more legendary seeming stories in the rabbinic works about the Tachash supported this translation of it being an aquatic mammal, and he proposed that the Tachash was actually a narwhal. He pointed to rabbinic claims of the Tachash being an animal that had a single horn and had variegated or multicolored skin. He also referenced the claim that there was only ever one of these animals and it only existed for the purpose of the tabernacle alone. His way of reconciling that was to point out that the narwhal's natural distribution is very far away. It's nowhere near the Mediterranean area. So his idea was that maybe one of them got swept down there in a current as a very rare event. So he seemed to be taking the Arabic word and then creating a string of connections with some of the rabbinic claims. Some of the criticisms of this view and other views similar to it was that this is just a misuse of the Arabic word. It can't be interpreted so broadly as to apply to so many different aquatic mammals. Personally, I certainly have my doubts about the claims of being a fantastic beast and things related to that, but I'm also skeptical about the criticism of the word because even though the Arabic may not normally be used so broadly, we're not dealing with the Arabic word necessarily. And if the Hebrew is connected because of an earlier shared root, it's possible the Hebrew word could have a more general meaning than the Arabic. Aside from the perspective that Aharoni described, there are other scholars that suggest dugong, which may be more in line with the Arabic word, but one criticism of that is the reference in Ezekiel about the sandals being made from this material. Supposedly, the skin of the dugong would not be very pliable and would not be very useful for luxury sandals aside from maybe the sole, so that is deemed an unlikely interpretation as a result. In my view, the similarity between the words is definitely there, but the criticisms may have some merit to them. One final suggestion for the word which I'll mention is that the word refers to beadwork, which was suggested by Stephanie Dawley. Part of the justification for this understanding is the comparison of the Hebrew word to an Akkadian word or an even earlier word which describes this practice of using gems and glass and precious metals and attaching them to leather and other materials. As far as Akkadian is concerned, I think it's undeniable that there are many connections between it and Hebrew, so it would not be unlikely to find a similar word there. The similarity is not overwhelmingly strong, but it's still a possibility. In favor of this beadwork was a practice done for sandals worn by royalty, so that could be seen as fitting the one context clue we have. Also, it supposedly was used on different coverings for different royal structures, such as a covering on a royal boat. Even just from a practical perspective, the idea of using such a thing as a covering for the tent of meeting would seem to be reasonable, and there wouldn't need to be any potential issues stemming from unclean animals being used either. One other part of this suggestion included attempts to connect it with the Greek translation. As I understand it, it was supposed to be standard practice at one time for such an article to be dyed deep blue as the background color for the beadwork. And maybe that was a part of the original meaning to it, thus hypothetically making a connection with the Greek translation. Maybe that is a possibility that would somewhat reconcile some of the historic claims about it. In my opinion, this interpretation seems pretty plausible. I haven't decided that this is the way that it has to be or anything, but I see this one as reasonably likely. So those are a number of the different views on Tachash. While knowing the meaning of this word may not have a direct impact on us yet in terms of what we do, the meaning of this word is relevant because it is a part of the Ten of Meeting, and the Ten of Meeting is relevant because it is a key part of the Torah.